January 5, 1943, 20 miles southwest of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Red Cochrane pressed his eye against the rubber cup of his rangefinder, tracking 4 Japanese Val dive bombers as they pulled away from their attack run on the cruiser USS Helena. The bombers had appeared overhead without warning, one scoring a near miss on the New Zealand cruiser Achilles before breaking off toward Rabaul. Cochrane's 5-inch guns had perhaps 30 seconds before the Vals disappeared into the tropical haze. He shouted fire control solutions to his gun crews, knowing the odds were astronomical. In 2 years of war, American anti-aircraft gunners had fired an average of 1,800 rounds to destroy a single aircraft. His battery would get off perhaps 6 rounds before the targets vanished. What Cochrane didn't know, what he couldn't know as his crews rammed shells into smoking gun breeches, was that 5 of those 6 rounds carried a secret that would transform naval warfare more completely than any technology since radar itself. Each shell's nose cone concealed a miniature radio transmitter no larger than a milk bottle, a device so sophisticated that its development had consumed more resources than the Manhattan Project would spend in its first 18 months. Within seconds, one of those shells would pass within 70 feet of a retreating Val, close enough for its radio pulse to bounce back and trigger a firing circuit. The resulting explosion would tear the bomber apart with a cloud of shrapnel, achieving in one shot what previously required hundreds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The destruction of that Val dive bomber represented the culmination of a desperate technical race that had begun 3 years earlier in a handful of cramped laboratories scattered across America. By January 1943, the proximity fuse had evolved from a theoretical impossibility, dismissed by German and Japanese engineers, into a weapon of such devastating effectiveness that its very existence was classified at the same level as the atomic bomb. Yet the path from concept to combat had required solving problems that seemed to violate the laws of physics themselves. How do you build a radio transmitter small enough to fit inside an artillery shell? How do you make vacuum tubes survive accelerations 20,000 times the force of gravity? How do you manufacture a device containing 130 miniaturized electronic components so cheaply that each unit could be fired once and destroyed? The answers to these questions would emerge not from a single brilliant breakthrough, but from the coordinated effort of over 100 factories, employing tens of thousands of workers who never knew what they were building. The story of the proximity fuse is the story of American industrial might, applied to a problem the rest of the world considered impossible. It's the story of how a handful of physicists convinced a skeptical navy that mathematics could accomplish what gunners' eyes and hands could not. And it's the story of how desperation, ingenuity, and the willingness to attempt the impossible combined to create a weapon that would save tens of thousands of American lives and fundamentally alter the balance of power in both the Pacific and European theaters. The crisis that sparked the proximity fuse's development was rooted in a problem as old as anti-aircraft warfare itself. Aircraft moved too fast and too unpredictably for gunners to reliably hit them. The mathematics were brutally simple and completely unforgiving. A 5-inch naval gun fired a shell at 2,600 feet per second. A Japanese bomber, attacking at 200 miles per hour, crossed 300 feet every second. The shell required 4 to 6 seconds to reach its target. In that time, aircraft would move 1,200 to 1,800 feet in 3 dimensions. The gunner had to predict not just where the aircraft would be, but calculate the shell's precise trajectory through space, while accounting for wind, air density, temperature, and the motion of his own ship. Traditional solutions to this impossible equation came in 2 varieties, both fundamentally inadequate. Contact fuses required a direct hit. Given the size of an aircraft relative to the volume of sky through which it moved, achieving such a hit approached the difficulty of throwing a baseball through a moving hula hoop from 3 city blocks away while riding a mechanical bull. Time fuses offered a marginally better solution. Gunners estimated the target's altitude and set a mechanical timer to detonate the shell at that height, hoping the aircraft would be close enough for shrapnel to cause damage. But time fuzzes depended on accurate altitude estimation, precise timing mechanisms, and the target, maintaining relatively predictable flight. Japanese and German pilots learned quickly to make radical altitude changes during their attack runs, rendering time fuses nearly useless. The statistical reality of anti-aircraft gunnery in 1941 painted a picture of systematic failure. During the first year of war, the US Navy fired an average of 1,800 rounds for every aircraft destroyed. The Royal Navy's statistics were even worse, exceeding 2,500 rounds per kill. Aboard American carriers and battleships in the Pacific, gunners watched Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers press home their attacks with near impunity, knowing that their defensive fire was little more than psychological harassment. The mathematics suggested that at current kill rates, the Navy would run out of ships before gunners ran out of ammunition. Rear Admiral William Blandy, who had spent decades studying naval gunnery, understood the crisis with painful clarity. In a memo, dated September 1940, he wrote with unusual bluntness for a senior officer, "Our current anti-aircraft systems are inadequate to the point of irrelevance. We cannot shoot fast enough, aim precisely enough, or explode close enough to reliably destroy modern aircraft. What we need is a shell that explodes when near its target, not when we think the target might be there. We need a proximity fuse. The problem is simple. I have no idea if creating such a device is even physically possible." Blandy's skepticism was well-founded. The technical requirements for a functioning proximity fuse seemed to belong more to science fiction than practical engineering. The device would need to fit inside the nose cone of a 5-inch shell, a space measuring approximately 3 inches in diameter and 7 inches long. Within that cramped volume, engineers would need to pack a complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power source, a safety mechanism to prevent premature detonation, and a firing circuit capable of triggering the main explosive charge within milliseconds of detecting a target. The entire assembly would need to survive being fired from a gun, an event that subjected every component to forces measuring 20,000 times the acceleration of gravity, forces sufficient to instantly destroy any conventional electronic device. Even if engineers could somehow build such a device, it would need to operate reliably after experiencing accelerations that would reduce most materials to powder. The shell would spin at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it traveled through the gun barrel's rifling. Once airborne, it would experience temperature variations from near freezing at altitude to well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit from air friction. The radio transmitter would need to function continuously during the shell's brief flight, broadcasting a signal strong enough to detect aircraft at useful distances while consuming power from a battery no larger than a small tube of toothpaste. The British had wrestled with these problems since 1939, making incremental progress on fuses for rockets and bombs, weapons that experienced relatively gentle accelerations compared to artillery shells. But British scientists remained convinced that a fuse capable of surviving the savage forces inside a gun barrel was simply impossible to build during wartime. The electronics didn't exist. The manufacturing techniques hadn't been developed. The theoretical problems alone would require years to solve, and Britain was fighting for its survival with weapons that could be built immediately, not theoretical marvels that might emerge from laboratories in the distant future. American involvement in the proximity fuse program began not with any great technical insight, but with bureaucratic innovation. On June 27, 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized the creation of the National Defense Research Committee, an organization designed to bridge the gap between academic scientists and military requirements. The NDRC was divided into sections, each tasked with solving specific technical problems. Section T, created in August 1940, received perhaps the most daunting assignment of all. Develop a proximity fuse for the Navy's 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. No one knew if this was possible. No one had ever done it before. The timeline was measured in months, not years. Leadership of Section T fell to Merle Tuve, a 39-year-old physicist whose background seemed almost perfectly suited to the impossible task ahead. Tuve had spent his career at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, conducting pioneering research in radio wave propagation and radar technology. He understood both the theoretical physics and practical engineering challenges of radio systems. More importantly, Tuve possessed an unusual combination of scientific brilliance and administrative pragmatism. He knew that developing the proximity fuse would require not just solving theoretical problems, but coordinating the efforts of dozens of contractors, establishing new manufacturing processes, and maintaining absolute secrecy while doing so. Tuve's first action revealed his approach to the project. Rather than starting from scratch, he sought out every existing piece of proximity fuse research he could find. In September 1940, he received crucial information from an unlikely source, the Tizard mission, a British scientific delegation that arrived in the United States carrying some of Britain's most closely guarded military secrets. Among the treasure trove of information the British shared was their research on proximity fuses for rockets, including circuit diagrams and test results from trials conducted at Christchurch Aerodrome. The British designs were elegant in theory, but inadequate for artillery shells. They used vacuum tubes that couldn't survive gun, barrel accelerations. Their circuits consumed too much power. Their manufacturing requirements exceeded what any mass production facility could handle. But the British work proved something crucial. The fundamental concept was sound. A radio transmitter could detect nearby objects and trigger a fuse. The physics worked. The challenge was engineering a device rugged enough and simple enough to be manufactured by the millions while surviving conditions that would destroy any normal electronic equipment. Tuve assembled a team of researchers whose diverse backgrounds reflected the multidisciplinary nature of the challenge. Richard Roberts, a nuclear physicist who had worked with Tuve for years, brought deep understanding of experimental technique. Lloyd Berkner, a radio engineer, contributed expertise in circuit design. Henry Porter brought knowledge of electronics manufacturing. Together, they began the methodical process of solving one impossible problem after another, each solution creating new challenges that seemed equally impossible. The vacuum tube problem exemplified the magnitude of the challenge. Every radio of the era used vacuum tubes, glass envelopes containing heated filaments and metal plates that controlled electron flow. These tubes were delicate. Drop a radio, and the tubes shattered. Shake a radio too vigorously, and filaments snapped. Fire a vacuum tube from a gun at accelerations measuring 20,000 Gs, and conventional tubes would explode into glass dust before the shell cleared the muzzle. Section T needed vacuum tubes that could survive impacts that would destroy a cinder block. The solution emerged from a collaboration between Section T and Sylvania Electric, one of the few companies with both the technical expertise and manufacturing capacity to attempt mass production of miniaturized rugged tubes. Sylvania's engineers began a systematic campaign to redesign every element of tube construction. They reduced tube size until each one measured less than 2 inches long and 3/4 of an inch in diameter, small enough to fit inside a shell nose cone. They anchored filaments with shock-resistant mounts. They designed glass envelopes strong enough to withstand massive forces, while thin enough to allow heat dissipation. They tested each iteration by mounting tubes in lead blocks and firing .22 caliber bullets at them, or loading them into homemade cannons and seeing what survived. The development process consumed thousands of tubes and countless hours of painstaking experimentation. Engineers at Sylvania worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, testing modifications, analyzing failures, and gradually evolving tubes that could survive conditions no electronic component had ever experienced. By May 1941, Sylvania had produced a prototype tube, the VT-98, that could reliably survive 20,000 G accelerations without failure. It was a triumph of engineering that went completely unnoticed by the public, but it solved the single most critical technical obstacle to creating a functional proximity fuse. While Sylvania wrestled with vacuum tubes, Section T tackled the equally daunting challenge of circuit design. The fuse's radio transmitter needed to be simple enough for mass production, yet sophisticated enough to distinguish aircraft from clouds, rain, sea spray, and the countless other objects that might reflect radio waves. Lloyd Berkner developed an elegant solution that separated the transmitter and receiver into distinct circuits, allowing each to be optimized independently. The transmitter broadcast a continuous wave signal. The receiver listened for reflections bouncing back from nearby objects. When reflections reached sufficient intensity, indicating an object within lethal range, the receiver triggered the firing circuit. The beauty of Berkner's design lay in its use of the Doppler effect, the same phenomenon that makes a train whistle change pitch as it passes. A shell traveling at 2,600 feet per second toward a stationary object would receive reflected radio waves at a frequency slightly different from the transmitted frequency. This frequency shift could be detected and used to distinguish real targets from stationary clutter like clouds or mountains. A target aircraft moving toward the shell would create an even larger Doppler shift, making detection more reliable. The circuit didn't need to identify what it detected, only recognize that something was approaching at a rate consistent with an aircraft interception. The power source presented yet another seemingly impossible challenge. The Fuze needed a battery small enough to fit in a shell, light enough not to affect ballistics, powerful enough to run a radio transmitter for several seconds, yet capable of sitting inert for months or years until needed. Conventional batteries were far too large and too fragile. Section T's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. They designed a battery that didn't activate until the shell was fired. The battery consisted of a small glass tube filled with electrolyte solution. At rest, the electrolyte remained inactive. When the shell fired, centrifugal force from the shell's rotation pushed the electrolyte outward, bringing it into contact with metal electrodes and creating an electrical charge. The battery activated in milliseconds and provided power for the Fuze's brief operational life. Safety mechanisms were equally critical and equally challenging. A proximity fuse was essentially a bomb designed to explode near any large metal object, including the ship that fired it. If a fuse armed too quickly after firing, it could detect the gun barrel or the ship itself and detonate, killing the gun crew. If it armed too slowly, it might miss the target entirely. Section T designed a multi-stage safety system using centrifugal switches that armed the fuse only after the shell had traveled a safe distance from the ship. Additional safety features prevented the fuse from arming during handling and transportation, while a self-destruct mechanism ensured that any fuse that didn't detonate during flight would eventually render itself harmless. By June 1942, after nearly 2 years of intensive development, Section T had produced a functioning prototype, designated the Mark 32. The device was a masterpiece of miniaturized engineering, packing 130 electronic components into a space smaller than a beer can. 5 miniaturized vacuum tubes controlled the radio circuits. A tiny battery activated by centrifugal force provided power. A mechanical fuse armed the detonator at a safe distance. Dozens of resistors, capacitors, and other components created the circuits needed for transmission, reception, and firing. The entire assembly weighed just over 1 pound and cost approximately $18 to manufacture, a price that seemed astronomical until compared to the cost of an aircraft, pilot training, and ship repairs from failed defensive fire. The Mark 32 still needed proof that it actually worked under combat conditions. In August 1942, the Navy conducted trials in the Chesapeake Bay aboard the newly commissioned cruiser USS Cleveland. For targets, they used radio-controlled drones, small aircraft that could maneuver evasively while controllers watched from a distance. The test plan called for 2 days of firing to evaluate the new fuses against conventional time-fused shells. Cleveland's gun crews prepared to demonstrate whether 2 years of intensive development had produced a revolutionary weapon or an expensive failure. The test lasted exactly 1 day. Cleveland's 5-inch guns engaged 3 target drones with proximity-fused shells. 4 salvos were fired. 3 drones were destroyed, their wreckage tumbling into the Chesapeake Bay before astonished observers. Gun crews hadn't needed to estimate altitude. They hadn't needed to calculate exact lead. They simply aimed in the general direction of the target and fired. The fuses did the rest, detecting the drones at distances, measuring dozens of feet, and detonating with precision that no human gunner could match. Navy observers immediately cancelled the remainder of the test and ordered Section T to begin preparations for mass production. The transition from laboratory prototype to mass-produced weapon presented challenges nearly as daunting as the original development. Each Mark 32 fuse contained 130 components, all of which needed to be manufactured to exacting tolerances. A single defective vacuum tube would render the entire fuse useless. A resistor with incorrect resistance would prevent the circuit from operating correctly. A battery that failed to activate would leave the shell powerless. The fuse needed to be assembled by workers who had no idea what they were building, using techniques that could be taught quickly and performed reliably under pressure. Section T's solution was to distribute production across dozens of contractors, each manufacturing specific components without knowing how they fit together. Sylvania produced vacuum tubes in a factory in Ipswich, Massachusetts, where hundreds of women workers assembled miniaturized tubes using techniques developed specifically for the proximity fuse program. Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati manufactured complete fuses, receiving components from suppliers across the country and assembling them in facilities operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. General Electric, RCA, Eastman Kodak, and dozens of other companies contributed specialized components, creating a supply chain that eventually involved 87 companies operating 110 factories. Security surrounding the proximity fuse rivaled that of the atomic bomb program. Workers were told only what they needed to know to perform their specific tasks. Vacuum tube assemblers knew they were making ruggedized tubes, but not what they would be used for. Component manufacturers received specifications, but no information about the final product. Only a handful of people understood the complete system. Commander William Parsons, the Navy officer who oversaw fuse deployment, personally escorted the first 5,000 proximity-fused shells from California to the South Pacific, traveling aboard the aircraft tender USS Wright with strict orders that no shells were to fall into enemy hands under any circumstances. The prohibition against allowing fuses to be captured drove deployment decisions throughout the war. Initial use was restricted exclusively to naval vessels in the Pacific, where any dud shells would fall into deep ocean rather than recoverable land. The fear was justified. If Japanese or German engineers obtained an intact fuse, they could reverse engineer it within weeks. Germany had already demonstrated this capability by copying a British magnetic mine that washed ashore early in the war. Section T scientists were particularly worried about German technical expertise. Intelligence reports suggested Germany had been researching proximity fuses since the mid-1930s. If Germany obtained an American fuse and completed their own development, Allied bombers over Europe would face anti-aircraft fire of unprecedented lethality. In late 1942, the first proximity-fused shells reached the Pacific Fleet. Commander Parsons personally supervised their distribution, dividing the initial shipment among 3 ships judged most likely to face air attack: the carriers USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga, and the cruiser USS Helena. Gunnery officers aboard all 3 ships received special briefing on the new ammunition. They were told the fuzzes were experimental. They were ordered to report detailed information on every round fired, and they were absolutely forbidden from allowing any fuse to fall into enemy hands. If a shell malfunctioned and failed to detonate, ships were ordered to recover it immediately or ensure its destruction. Lieutenant Red Cochrane aboard USS Helena knew none of this background when Japanese Val dive bombers appeared over his ship on January 5, 1943. His immediate concerns were more practical: track the targets, calculate range and bearing, fire before they disappeared. His battery fired 3 salvos, 6 shells total. 5 carried proximity fuzzes. 1 shell passed close enough to a retreating Val for its radio transmitter to detect the aircraft and trigger detonation. The bomber disintegrated in a cloud of shrapnel and flame, tumbling into the Pacific before its pilot could react. Cochrane's after-action report was brief and matter-of-fact, typical of naval gunnery reports. 3 salvos fired, 1 enemy aircraft destroyed, range approximately 12,000 yards, target was departing at high speed. Recommend continued use of special fuzzed projectiles. What his report couldn't capture was the significance of that single kill. For the first time in history, an artillery shell had destroyed an aircraft without direct contact, guided by electronics rather than human prediction. The age of smart weapons had begun. The combat effectiveness of proximity fuses became undeniable over the following months. Throughout 1943, the Navy tracked every round, fired, and every aircraft destroyed. The statistics were staggering and unambiguous. Conventional time-fused shells required an average of 508 rounds to destroy 1 aircraft. Proximity-fused shells required just 155 rounds per kill, more than 3 times more effective. By mid-1943, proximity fuzzes accounted for only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition fired, yet they were credited with 51% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The lethality increase came not just from hitting more targets, but from the vastly increased kill radius of each shell. A conventional time-fused shell that exploded at the correct altitude created a lethal fragment pattern covering approximately 60 square feet. Most of that pattern was wasted, spraying shrapnel through empty air. A proximity-fused shell detected the target and detonated at optimum range, typically 30 to 70 feet, creating a fragment pattern covering 3,000 square feet. The mathematical advantage was overwhelming. A proximity-fused shell was 50 times more likely to damage or destroy an aircraft than a conventional shell, even when both exploded at similar altitudes. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet in the South Pacific, grasped the implications immediately. After reviewing initial combat reports, he issued orders that proximity fuzzes were to be used in 75% of all anti-aircraft ammunition, the highest proportion supply allowed. His reasoning was coldly practical. The Navy was losing ships and men to Japanese air attacks at unsustainable rates. Proximity fuses dramatically improved survival odds. The cost in ammunition was irrelevant compared to the cost of losing carriers, cruisers, and the sailors aboard them. The human dimension of proximity fuse effectiveness revealed itself most clearly during night actions, when darkness made visual gunnery nearly impossible. Japanese torpedo bombers, particularly the twin-engine Mitsubishi G-4M Betty, had terrorized American surface forces throughout 1942 and early 1943. These aircraft attacked at night, skimming low over the water to avoid radar detection, releasing torpedoes at close range before defenders could react effectively. Time-fused shells were nearly useless against such targets. Gunners couldn't see for the aircraft to estimate altitude. They fired blind, hoping to put enough shells in the air to deter attacks or achieve lucky hits. Proximity-fused shells transformed night defense completely. Radar could track attacking aircraft even in total darkness. Gun directors could aim weapons based on radar data. Proximity fuses didn't need to see targets, only detect them with radio waves. The combination of radar, fire control, and proximity fuzzes created defensive capability approaching that of daylight operations. Japanese pilots discovered that night attacks were no longer the safe option they had been. American ships could track them in darkness, engage at longer ranges, and achieve kill rates that made night torpedo attacks prohibitively costly. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 showcased proximity fuse effectiveness on a massive scale. American carrier task forces faced coordinated attacks by over 300 Japanese aircraft in what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American fighters destroyed the majority of attackers, but dozens of Japanese aircraft penetrated to the carrier formations. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries, armed predominantly with proximity-fused ammunition, created a defensive barrage of unprecedented density. Japanese pilots flew into walls of exploding shells that detonated automatically as aircraft passed nearby. Of approximately 75 Japanese aircraft that reached the American fleet, only one succeeded in landing a single bomb on one ship. American gunners claimed over 200 aircraft destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, an exaggeration typical of combat reports. Post-battle analysis confirmed at least 65 aircraft destroyed by ship-based gunfire, a number that would have been impossible without proximity fuzzes. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitcher during the fast carrier operations, reflected years later on the transformation proximity fuses brought to naval warfare. When I joined the fast carrier task force, all our 5-inch ammunition was fitted with VT fuses. Those fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. Before VT fuzzes, night attacks by Japanese torpedo bombers were terrifying. We could hear them but couldn't see them, couldn't shoot them effectively. After VT fuzzes, combined with radar fire control, we could engage them as effectively at night as in daylight. It changed everything. The proximity fuse's success in the Pacific led to increasing pressure from the Army to authorize its use in Europe. American and British forces landing in Sicily, Italy, and eventually Normandy faced constant threat from German aircraft. The Luftwaffe, though declining in strength, remained capable of damaging raids against invasion beaches and supply ports. Army anti-aircraft units used conventional time-fused shells with the same mediocre results the Navy had experienced before proximity foes. Army commanders who learned about the Navy's secret weapon wanted it desperately for their own use. But the prohibition against using proximity fuses where they might be recovered on land remained absolute through most of 1944. The risk of German capture and reverse engineering was considered too great. Germany's technical expertise was respected and feared. Intelligence reports indicated German scientists had been researching multiple proximity fuse designs, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine noise and radio fuses similar to American designs. If Germany obtained an American fuse and completed development of their own version, the results could be catastrophic. Allied bomber formations over Germany would face anti-aircraft fire that achieved kill rates 4 or 5 times higher than current defenses. The strategic bombing campaign might become unsustainable. The situation changed dramatically in summer 1944, when Germany began launching Vone flying bombs against London. These pilotless aircraft, essentially cruise missiles powered by pulse jet engines, appeared over England by the hundreds, each carrying a 2,000-pound warhead. British air defences struggled to intercept them. Fighter aircraft could shoot down V-1s, but only if they caught them, and the V-1s flew faster than most British fighters at low altitude. Anti-aircraft guns using conventional time fuzzes achieved mediocre results, destroying approximately 24% of V-1s engaged during the first week of attacks. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, facing a weapon that threatened to devastate London and break British morale, authorised emergency measures. He requested American proximity fuses for anti-aircraft guns defending against V-1s. The request went to the highest levels of American command. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, and Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, both supported Churchill's request. The strategic calculus had shifted. The Vone threat was immediate and severe. The risk of German capture of American fuses was outweighed by the desperate need to defend London. In late June 1944, American scientists from Applied Physics Laboratory flew to England with modified proximity fuses designed specifically for British 3.7-inch and American 90mm anti-aircraft guns. Production facilities in Cincinnati worked around the clock to manufacture thousands of fuses. British Prime Minister Churchill authorised special Lancaster bomber flights to transport fuses from Cincinnati to England, an extraordinary measure reflecting the urgency of the situation. By early July, British anti-aircraft batteries defending London received proximity-fused ammunition. The results exceeded even optimistic predictions. During the first week with proximity fuses, British gunners destroyed 46% of V1s engaged, nearly double their previous success rate. By the second week, kill rates climbed to 67% as gunners gained experience. During the third week, 79% of V1s were destroyed. On the last day, V1s were launched in large numbers against England. 104 were detected by early warning radar. British gunners destroyed all but 4. The Vone threat, which had seemed capable of terrorising London indefinitely, was effectively neutralised by proximity fuses, combined with improved radar and gun-laying techniques. Ralph Baldwin, a senior physicist at Applied Physics Laboratory and one of the proximity fuses developers, reflected on the Vone defence with quiet satisfaction. The last day in which a large quantity of V1s were launched against England, 104 were detected. Only 4 reached London. The proximity fuse had proven itself capable of defending against the first generation of guided missiles, a capability no one had anticipated during the fuse's original development. The liberation of Antwerp in September 1944 created another crisis that only proximity fuses could address. The Belgian port was crucial for supplying Allied armies advancing into Germany. Without Antwerp's capacity to unload supplies, the Allied advance would stall from logistical starvation. Germany recognized Antwerp's strategic importance and subjected the port to intensive bombardment by both Vone flying bombs and V2 ballistic missiles. Over 5 months, Germany launched approximately 2,500 V1s and V2s at Antwerp, attempting to destroy the port facilities and render them unusable. American and British anti-aircraft batteries, equipped with proximity fuses, created a defensive umbrella over Antwerp that destroyed the majority of incoming V1s. The V2s, travelling faster than sound and arriving without warning, couldn't be intercepted. But the V1s, slower and detectable by radar, faced the same lethal defensive fire that had protected London. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire maintained Antwerp's operational capacity throughout the final months of the war, enabling the logistics support that sustained Allied armies advancing into Germany. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 finally forced authorization of proximity fuse use by ground artillery against enemy troops. When German armoured forces broke through American lines in the Ardennes forest, launching Hitler's last major offensive in the West, General Eisenhower faced a crisis that threatened to derail the entire Allied advance. German troops, attacking under cover of bad weather that grounded Allied air support, achieved surprise and deep penetration. American forces needed every advantage available to stop the German offensive. Eisenhower personally authorized unrestricted use of proximity fuses by field artillery, lifting the prohibition that had kept them from ground use throughout the war. Large stocks of artillery shells fitted with proximity Fuzes had already been shipped to Europe in anticipation of eventual authorization. American artillery batteries received proximity-fused ammunition and instructions on its use. The transformation of artillery effectiveness was immediate and devastating to German forces. Traditional artillery shells buried themselves in earth before exploding, their blast and fragments absorbed by the ground. Only troops in the immediate impact area faced lethal danger. Troops in foxholes or trenches enjoyed substantial protection. Proximity-fused artillery shells detected the ground as they descended and detonated 20 to 50 feet in the air, creating air bursts that showered fragments down on troops over wide areas. Foxholes and trenches provided no protection. Troops caught in proximity-fused artillery barrages faced inescapable walls of descending shrapnel. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army during the Bulge, witnessed proximity fuse effectiveness with professional appreciation, bordering on amazement. In a letter to the War Department dated December 19, 1944, he wrote with characteristic bluntness, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed, by actual count, 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I'm glad you all thought of it first." Patton's actual count was almost certainly an exaggeration, typical of combat reports. But the fundamental point was valid. Proximity-fused artillery increased casualty rates by factors of 3 to 5 compared to conventional shells. German troops caught in such barrages faced statistical certainty of death or wounding. The psychological impact was profound and demoralizing. German soldiers could dig foxholes against conventional artillery. They could take cover in buildings or behind walls. Against proximity-fused shells that exploded in air above them, no cover was effective. The only protection was not being there when the shells arrived. Allied anti-aircraft batteries, equipped with proximity fuses, accounted for the destruction of 417 German aircraft during the Battle of the Bulge, decimating the Luftwaffe forces supporting the ground offensive. Combined with ground artillery using proximity fuses, the weapon proved decisive in blunting the German advance. By late January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated, German forces were in retreat, and Allied armies resumed their advance into Germany. The proximity fuse had proven itself not just as an anti-aircraft weapon, but as a revolutionary tool for ground combat. The Pacific War's final phase showcased proximity, fuse effectiveness against the most desperate Japanese tactic, the kamikaze. Beginning in October 1944, Japanese commanders began organizing suicide attacks where pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. Conventional anti-aircraft fire, which attempted to shoot down aircraft before they reached their targets, had limited effectiveness against pilots who didn't care about survival. A damaged aircraft could still complete a kamikaze attack if the pilot remained conscious and in control. Proximity-fused shells proved particularly effective against kamikazes because they didn't require direct hits. A shell passing within 70 feet of a diving aircraft would detonate, shredding the plane with fragments. Even if the pilot survived, the damaged aircraft often became uncontrollable, missing its target or crashing prematurely. During the Okinawa campaign in spring 1945, American ships faced over 1,500 kamikaze attacks. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, combined with fighter interceptions, destroyed the majority of attackers before they reached their targets. The Navy still suffered severe losses, 36, and ships sunk and 368 damaged, but without proximity fuses, losses would have been catastrophically higher. In May 1945, the destroyers USS Luce and USS Hadley faced one of the war's most intense kamikaze attacks off Okinawa. Over 150 Japanese aircraft attacked both ships in a concentrated assault. Hadley's gun crews, firing proximity-fused ammunition as fast as loaders could ram shells into smoking breeches, destroyed attacking aircraft at rates approaching 1 per minute. The horizon filled with burning aircraft, fragments falling into the sea like rain. 6 damaged kamikazes or pieces of destroyed aircraft struck Hadley, causing severe damage but not sinking her. Luce was less fortunate, taking multiple direct hits and sinking with heavy loss of life. But Hadley's survival, despite facing overwhelming numbers, demonstrated proximity, fuse effectiveness. Her crew fired proximity-fused shells so rapidly that gun barrels began overheating, yet the fuses continued functioning, detonating near targets with mechanical reliability that seemed almost miraculous. Japanese commanders recognized American anti-aircraft superiority and attempted to develop countermeasures. Intelligence officers debriefed captured American sailors, seeking information about the mysterious shells that seemed to explode near aircraft automatically. They suspected some form of proximity fuse but couldn't determine the mechanism. Japanese scientists had actually developed their own proximity fuse design, but it entered service too late and in too small numbers to affect the war. The single recorded use of a Japanese proximity fuse came in a bomb dropped during an air raid, where it functioned successfully but changed nothing. The final statistics of proximity fuse production and use reveal the scale of the program. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 22 million proximity fuses, manufactured by 87 companies operating 110 factories. Crosley Corporation alone produced 5,200,000 fuses, 24% of total production. The company employed 10,000 workers operating around the clock, 7 days per week, becoming Cincinnati's largest employer. At peak production, American factories assembled 70,000 proximity fuzzes per day, each containing 130 miniaturized components, each tested to ensure reliability. The cost of the proximity fuse program exceeded $1 billion in 1940s currency, approximately $15 billion in today's money. This made it the third most expensive military research and development program of the war, exceeded only by the atomic bomb and radar development. Yet, measured by impact on combat effectiveness and lives saved, the proximity fuse program delivered extraordinary value. Conservative estimates suggest proximity fuses increased anti-aircraft kill rates by 300 to 500%. Applied across millions of anti-aircraft rounds fired during the war's final 2 years, this translated to thousands of aircraft destroyed that would otherwise have survived. Each aircraft destroyed represented attacks prevented, ships saved, and lives preserved. The Germans never successfully deployed proximity fuses during the war, despite extensive research. German scientists developed over 30 different proximity fuse designs, using acoustic, optical, electrostatic, and radio detection methods. Several designs functioned successfully in laboratory testing, but Germany's industrial base, under constant bombardment and facing raw material shortages, couldn't support the mass production and quality control required for reliable proximity fuses. German military leadership also doubted whether electronics could survive gun barrel accelerations, the same skepticism British scientists had expressed early in the war. By the time German engineers confirmed proximity fuses were possible, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in militarily significant quantities. Post-war interrogations of German officers revealed that many had suspected American use of proximity fuses, but couldn't confirm it or develop countermeasures. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most experienced fighter commanders, reflected on American anti-aircraft effectiveness with professional respect. By late 1944, American defensive fire had become extraordinarily effective, both from ships and ground batteries. We suspected they had developed some form of automatic fuse, but we never captured one to examine. Our scientists told us such a device was impossible to manufacture in wartime. The Americans proved them wrong. The proximity fuse's influence extended far beyond World War II. The technology, pioneered by Section T and Applied Physics Laboratory, became the foundation for virtually every guided weapon system developed in subsequent decades. Modern anti-aircraft missiles use radar proximity fuses descended directly from the Mark 32. Artillery shells with programmable air-burst fuses trace their ancestry to proximity fuse research. The Patriot missile system, the Israeli Iron Dome, the Navy's Phalanx close-in weapon system, all incorporate principles first developed during the desperate race to create a weapon that seemed impossible. Dr. Vannevar Bush, who had created the National Defense Research Committee and overseen the proximity fuse program, reflected after the war on what the program had demonstrated. The proximity fuse showed that American industry and American science, working together under pressure, could achieve what the rest of the world considered impossible. The Germans and Japanese had larger head starts in proximity fuse research. The British had done pioneering work. But American mass production capability, combined with American willingness to attempt the impossible, produced a weapon that changed warfare. It was perhaps the clearest example of how industrial might could be converted directly into military effectiveness. Merle Tuve, who had led Section T through the development effort, returned to Carnegie Institution after the war and rarely spoke publicly about the proximity fuse. He continued his career in physics, made significant contributions to understanding of the ionosphere, and died in 1982. His obituaries mentioned the proximity fuse in passing, but most readers had no sense of the magnitude of what he had accomplished. The weapon he helped create had saved thousands of American lives, destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft, and demonstrated that mathematical precision could replace human skill in combat. James Van Allen, who had worked on vacuum tube development for the proximity fuse, went on to become one of America's most distinguished space scientists, discovering the radiation belts around Earth that bear his name. In interviews late in his life, he reflected on the proximity Fuze work with satisfaction. "We were young, we were motivated by the urgent needs of war, and we were attempting things that seemed impossible. The remarkable thing wasn't that we succeeded. The remarkable thing was that anyone believed we could succeed. Conventional wisdom said proximity fuzzes couldn't be built in wartime. We built 22 million of them. The workers who assembled proximity fuses, particularly the thousands of women who worked in factories across America, mostly never knew what they were building. Security classifications meant they understood only their specific tasks, not the larger purpose. After the war, when proximity fuse information was declassified, many former workers learned for the first time that their careful assembly of miniaturized vacuum tubes or their precise winding of tiny resistor coils had contributed to a weapon that had helped win the war. Their meticulous work, repeated millions of times under pressure to maintain impossible production schedules, had been as crucial as the brilliant physics and engineering that designed the fuzzes. The proximity fuse represents a particular type of technological triumph, the kind where desperate necessity drove innovation beyond what peacetime development would have considered feasible. No commercial market would have justified developing miniaturized vacuum tubes capable of surviving 20,000 G accelerations. No peacetime budget would have funded research into batteries activated by centrifugal force. But war created urgency that rendered impossible meaningless. If physics permitted something, engineers would find a way to build it. If manufacturing seemed impossibly difficult, industrial engineers would develop new techniques. If costs seemed prohibitive, they were irrelevant compared to the cost of losing the war. The story of one engineer's impossible proximity fuse is, ultimately, a story about what happens when brilliant people, given urgent purpose and adequate resources, refuse to accept conventional limits. German and Japanese engineers, working with less resources and greater skepticism, concluded proximity fuses couldn't be manufactured in wartime. British engineers, facing the same conclusion, shared their research with Americans and hoped for the best. American engineers, led by Merle Tuve and his Section T team, decided impossible merely meant difficult and expensive. They built the impossible weapon, manufactured it by the millions, and deployed it in time to affect the war's outcome. The proximity fuse increased anti-aircraft kill rates by 300 to 500%, exactly as the title of this story suggests. That improvement translated directly into aircraft destroyed, ships saved, and lives preserved. Every Japanese torpedo bomber shot down before reaching its target was a torpedo that didn't strike an American carrier. Every German fighter destroyed before attacking a bomber formation was a bomber that returned safely. Every Vone destroyed over the English Channel was a Vone that didn't explode in London. The mathematics of war are brutal but precise. Increase kill rates by 500%, and you change the fundamental balance of combat power. Lieutenant Red Cochrane, whose battery aboard USS Helena fired the first combat proximity-fused shells, survived the war and returned to a peacetime Navy career. He rose to the rank of commander before retiring in the 1960s. In interviews late in his life, he recalled that January morning off Guadalcanal with characteristic modesty. "We fired at a retreating bomber and it blew up. We thought we'd gotten lucky with a good shot. We didn't know until later that we'd fired the first shots of a revolution in naval warfare. The funny fuse, as General Patton called it, changed everything. We just didn't know it yet." The proximity fuse's legacy endures in every smart weapon, every guided missile, every automated defense system deployed today. The fundamental principle that sensors and mathematics can accomplish what human eyes and hands cannot has become so deeply embedded in modern warfare that it's easy to forget someone had to prove it first. The proximity fuse proved it in the most demanding environment imaginable, combat against desperate enemies fighting for survival. The weapon that seemed impossible in 1940 had become indispensable by 1945. demonstrating that the greatest technical barrier is often simply the belief that something cannot be done. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.